Good morning, everyone. So if you were able to tune in the last time I gave a talk, I started talking about Buddhism and politics. And I looked at a particular book by a person named Moore, and it was Buddhism and Political Theory. And it sort of looked at early Buddhist texts to try to extract kind of a normative political theory. So like basically what we should do about politics as Buddhists. And there's no kind of single text that does that in the Pali Canon, but there are a few that give us some hints. And what he sort of extracted out of the text that he looked at was kind of a three-part system based on no self. So the idea that, you know, we're impermanent and therefore kind of interconnected with other people. What he called limited citizenship, which is unlike Western political traditions, there's no kind of moral mandate to participate in politics. And so it's sort of similar to like the way the Amish maybe approach politics in the US, if you're familiar with that. And third, what he called hypothetical ethics, which is the notion that unlike sort of Christian ethics, which are, you know, ordained by kind of a higher power, in Buddhism, ethics are part of our practice in the sense that, you know, if you follow Buddhist ethics, you'll presumably progress along the path, but if you don't, you won't, and that's up to you. But you don't really have to follow the ethics if you don't want to. It's just in your interest to do so. So that was the kind of basic unifying idea behind his analysis looking at these early Pali texts. Before I jump into what I looked at this week, which is going to be like sort of engaged Buddhism stuff, and I looked at a couple of different essays, and I'll get to those, but Jeff asked a question at the end of the last talk regarding like sort of the progression of political theory in Buddhism over time. And I kind of suggested that the relationship between Buddhists and the state didn't change all that much. That's actually kind of wrong. So I wanted to correct that. And I sort of knew that. I don't know why I said that, but I think that that's kind of a historical stumbling block, is to assume that, you know, nothing happened between like, you know, the Roman Empire and modern history or something. And in the same way, I guess you can do this same thing with you know, Asian history. So I wanted to talk briefly just about kind of the history of the interaction between Buddhism and the state in Japan, just because it's the, you know, place that I know most about. But I think that, you know, there would be similar changes probably in other Buddhist countries as well. So the problem though is like unlike the first part of the talk that I gave, you know, in that case we had kind of a normative theory that we could extract. So what should you do regarding politics based on Pali texts? For the situation in Japan, I'm not really sure that there is much in the way of like normative statements about how Buddhists should interact with politics, but we do have a lot of historical information about how they actually did. Whether or not, you know, they should have been doing that or not is a different question. But so I wanted to talk sort of briefly just about kind of how things unfolded in the Japanese situation. So this is, I'm basing most of this off this book called the Nanzan Guide to Japanese Religions, which is really, if you're interested in learning more about religion in Japan, this is a really great volume that covers everything from the earliest history that we know about up to, you know, contemporary times. So Buddhism was introduced to Japan like officially around 550. We don't have like an exact date. And there's some suggestion that, you know, Buddhists were already in Japan well before that. There's some Chinese chronicles that suggest that, you know, Buddhist emissaries were coming over to Japan. But nothing was really written down in Japan until the early 8th century. So we don't have a lot of information about kind of the early interaction of Buddhism with the state, or at all. But the context initially for Buddhism's introduction to Japan was that there was a war being fought by like a king in Baekje, which is like one of the Korean kingdoms. And he was trying to get some Japanese soldiers to fight on his behalf. So he sent this elaborate gold and bronze Buddha statue to sort of the most powerful clan in Japan at the time, which was the Yamato clan, which is the one that claimed to be descended from the sun goddess, basically. And that's like the basis for the whole emperor system in Japan, started with this clan. And there was debate as to whether or not they should accept basically this new god as they saw it. So when Buddhism was introduced, in Japan, they had a system, what we would now call Shinto, although it wasn't like an organized system. Basically, you had like every clan had its own kind of gods, and they were usually nature-based and so forth. So when the Buddha statue was introduced, they just sort of, fitted into that system and said, oh, this is another kami, another god, but should we accept it? And ultimately, they decided that they should, and it was sort of for pragmatic political reasons, because up until that point, you had all these competing clans in Japan, and the Yamato clan, being the most powerful among them, said, oh, this is hypothetical, we don't really know exactly, but it would seem to make sense that they would want this kind of universalizing, god, as it were, because each clan having its own system of deities made it really hard to govern universally. So they said, oh, if we have everyone getting on board with this one universalizing religion, of course they didn't conceive it as like a religion exactly, but that would be beneficial for them. So that was the context in which Buddhism was introduced to Japan. So it was very political and very pragmatic right from the beginning. So for the first kind of 600 years or so, I guess, that Buddhism was in Japan, there was a pretty strongly centralized system. So, in that early system, there were these clans, but then things consolidated behind a single emperor in the Heian period, which went from 794 to 1185. And they had a system they called in Japanese the ritsu ryo. So it's like, ritsu is like a penal code, basically. It's the same term, actually, that we use in Buddhism to describe the Vinaya. And ryo is like taxation. So it's, a system where there's a centralized law code and taxation system. And this was based on the Chinese model. So it was a very strongly centralized government. And Buddhism was patronized by the state, basically in order to kind of protect the rulers and, ensure good crop harvests, and it was sort of for magical reasons, basically. And this system that developed is called by historians in Japanese, it's called the Kenmitsu Taisei, which means the esoteric system. And so if you don't know what those terms mean, so exoteric is something that's like a teaching that's intended kind of for the public, or it's open at least. And esoteric is something that's kind of for the initiated only, and usually has kind of more magical connotations. And those terms actually come from Greek, and the same thing existed in ancient Greek. There were teachers who had both exoteric and esoteric teachings. Some teachings were only intended for initiated students. But in the Japanese context, you had a number of different schools. These were sort of loose. They're not quite as strong as the different denominations that we have nowadays. But basically, they all had different exoteric teachings. That is, different things that, for example, with Dogen, the Dogen's much later, but something like the Shobogenzo is an exoteric teaching, because you can pick it up and read it, and it's not, hidden away or intended only for, particular students or something. An esoteric teaching is something like the Daihishin Dharani. So, I talked a little bit about that before, but it's something that, if you read it, it doesn't make sense. And in order to figure out what it means, you need to learn about it from, as an initiated teacher, basically. And, these things are thought to have like special power and stuff. So basically what this means, this exoteric, esoteric system, was that each school had its own exoteric teaching, but they all used esoteric powers to serve the state. And that continued for a long time, and including in Soto Zen. So that's why we chant the Daihi Shindarani, basically, is because, these kind of things were meant to serve the state or the population, while coexisting with a more kind of practical exoteric doctrine. So I think that that's kind of interesting. I'm kind of getting off topic a little bit, but it's interesting stuff. Okay, so at the end of the Heian period, the centralized government started to break down, and this was the beginning of kind of feudalism in Japan. So instead of having an emperor who ruled everything, things started to fracture, and there were different warlords, and ultimately there was a shogun who, like the chief warlord guy who controlled the whole country. And this was the start of what's called the Kamakura period, which almost coincides perfectly with when Dogen was born. So the Kamakura period begins in 1185, I think, and Dogen was born in 1200. At this time, the Buddhist denominations, I mean, not really denominations, but schools, I guess you could say. So, usually they're based around a temple. So, like within the Tendai school, there are a bunch of major temples, and those were all competing with each other. It wasn't really like a unified thing. But at any rate, during that time, they started to amass lots of land. So the central government no longer controlled land, basically. So warlords and Buddhist temples, were snatching it up, and often you'd get wealthy patrons donating land to temples as a way of, getting merit for themselves. And what happened over time is, they had amassed so much land that they actually had like basically these little micro-states. And so like the Tendai school around Kyoto and the Shingon school in Mount Koya basically had their own states where they had police power and court power, and it was basically a theocracy. And this is sort of similar to the situation in Europe too. Like, so, when I was a undergraduate, I studied in Germany for a year in a city called Münster, which, before Germany was unified, was a bishopric, which was like basically the same kind of thing, where you had a bishop controlling the territory. So at any rate, that was the situation in Japan. So these temples also had armies and would fight each other, and there were monks in the armies, and they would fight between temples and against shoguns, and it was very kind of strange, messy situation, not at all what we think of what Buddhists should be doing. So it would be really interesting to know more about what it was like to live in one of those kind of basically religious states in Japan, or to know like the extent to which the people in charge, thought what they were doing was justified by, Buddhist ethics and so forth. But at least in English, it doesn't seem we have a whole lot of information on that at this point. So might have to wait to find out more. So at any rate, after the Kamakura period, then there was the Muromachi period, and then you have like the Warring States period, like within that. And this is when there was no single shogun, but things fractured into lots of different little kind of semi-autonomous military states. And during this time, some of the temples became really powerful. So like the city of Osaka now was the center of a Pure Land temple, actually, initially. And it had all these kind of radical kind of Pure Land people called the Iko-Iki. And when some of the main kind of warlords were trying to unify Japan, one of the main problems they had was, basically overcoming these Buddhist kind of states. So the one centered in Osaka, Oda Nobunaga, who's like one of the really important unifiers of Japan, he had to siege the city of Osaka with all these Buddhists in it for like 10 years before he was able to take it. And at the same time, you had Christianity introduced by Jesuit priests from Spain and Portugal. And Oda Nobunaga was trying to like play the Christians against the Buddhists. And, it's a very kind of strange situation where religion is playing like a huge role in everything, but not in the way that we would kind of want or expect. Anyway, so eventually Japan gets unified, and you enter what's called the Edo period or the Tokugawa period, when the capital was moved to Tokyo. And that was a prolonged period of peace. So unlike the previous several centuries where you had all this warfare, things calmed down quite a bit. And during that time, so the Tokugawa government was very worried about Christians because, you had something like 300,000 Christians in Western Japan that kind of cropped up very quickly after the introduction of Christianity by Jesuit missionaries. And so their solution to this problem was to require every single person in Japan to be a member of a Buddhist temple. So Buddhists basically became like police almost, so sort of like the Stasi or something for the Japanese state. And if you didn't register with a temple, you could be executed on the basis that you were probably a Christian. So during the Tokugawa period, the temples became really powerful because every single person was required to give them donations every year. But at the same time, even though the temples were very integrated with the government, they also lost their own autonomy because everything was being dictated to them by the Tokugawa government. So at any rate, that's kind of a brief history. And then at the end of this, you enter the modern period. There's a revolution to kind of reinstate the emperor on kind of nationalist grounds. There's massive resentment for Buddhists because they've been acting in this kind of police capacity for so long. And furthermore, the emperor is strongly associated with Shinto, which by that time has kind of developed into its own independent theory. Previously, it was like very intertwined with Buddhism. And so there was a big backlash against Buddhists. They lost tons of their land and power in the early modern period. And then you have the war, and then now they have a constitution that's kind of basically like ours regarding religion. So, because we wrote it for them. But yeah, so that's kind of a very brief history of Buddhists' interaction with the state in Japanese history. But like I said, we don't really have a normative sense of what people should have been doing. We do know a lot about what they were doing, which probably wasn't very good. But anyway, I think it's interesting to have that context because a lot of it shapes the tradition that we practice. So for example, the reason that we chant things like the Daihishin Darani and the Enmei Juku Kanongyo is related to this esoteric system, and it was directly tied to how Buddhism was interacting with the state. So, anyway, I hope that clears up my my inaccurate statement last time. And with that, I will move on to the kind of main material for the day. So this time around, I read a book called Mindful Politics, which is a book about, it's a collection of essays about engaged Buddhism. And, some of them were not actually really about Buddhism. Like there was an essay in there about like Sun Tzu and the art of war and its relation to politics, which, I didn't read. And there are a few others that, are less about politics and more just about sort of, how to be a good person in the modern world and that kind of thing. So not all of them were applicable. And some of them were, like, one of the things that I would criticize, I guess, about the engage. I mean, it's not really the engaged Buddhist movement, but I think that there's a potential to take like any little issue that you believed in before, and then you become a Buddhist and you just graft it together and say, oh, well, this is Buddhism now because I said so. And, you know, one of the things that was really striking about this, one of the essays in here, in the first paragraph of it, you know, it said we as Buddhists should be, you know, fighting against the government conspiracy to like cover up the fact that vaccines cause autism. And I was kind of disappointed that Wisdom published that. But, you know, it's that kind of thing that's like anything goes, basically. But that being said, there were some very good conscientious essays in here, and I wanted to talk mainly about one and possibly another if we have time. So the one that I spent the most time on was an essay by Rita Gross. And Rita Gross is, or was, she died a few years ago, a prominent academic Buddhist studies person. She focused mostly on feminism in Buddhism. Her kind of magnum opus is this book, Buddhism After Patriarchy. But in this book here, she had an essay called The Wisdom in the Anger. And she practiced in the Tibetan tradition, in Trungpa's lineage, I believe. You know, is a kind of controversial teacher, but she seems to have good things to say about him. And the basic kind of topic here is how do we engage in politics without succumbing to the three poisons of, you know, hatred, aversion, and delusion? Because it seems that most people that engage in politics are very kind of wrapped up in those. So I'll just sort of walk through the argument that she makes here. So as a starting point, Buddhism, of course, discourages dualism, at least Mahayana Buddhism. And, you know, early Buddhism, dualism is not really a thing, but at least we can say that about Mahayana Buddhism. So she says, for example, though the difference between friends and enemies, between those who are right and those who are wrong, can feel very real, Buddhist analytical meditation always shows that such feelings, though temporarily real, are ultimately illusory. So this gets, you know, tied up with interconnection as well, of course, since if there's really no separation between self and other, you know, and, you know, right and wrong are just relative terms, it's hard to say that, you know, there's kind of an ultimate distinction. And further, you know, Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism would say that, you know, when we act on the basis of dualism, this will lead to grief, regret, and suffering. But then, you know, by contrast, of course, politics, you know, very readily divides the world, the country, the neighborhood, or even the practice center into those who are right and wrong. That's, you know, the basic premise on which politics works. And if you try to be friendly to both sides, you know, you're often seen as sort of like a traitor to both. So she mentions the case of Thich Nhat Hanh in Vietnam, who, with his retinue of monks and nuns during the Civil War in Vietnam, you know, helped both sides, and both sides didn't like him. So that can be one of the consequences of politics is, you know, you're either my friend or my enemy. And so from this, there can be, you know, this conclusion that the dualism of politics as usual is basically antithetical to Buddhist ways of viewing reality. But if Gross is going to argue that that isn't the case, it's just how we approach politics that has to be a particular way. So she describes her own experience as being involved in feminism prior to becoming a Buddhist. And when she did start practicing Buddhism, you know, she was basically told that, you know, causes like feminism or politics more generally are sources of attachment. You should just let them go. And, you know, I think that this view sometimes still exists in politics. And hopefully, when I talked last week and, talked about this idea of limited citizenship, that's not the view that I was advocating. The idea there, and he makes it kind of explicit, is that, we have competing things that we can do with our time. And we can get involved with causes, or we can spend a lot of time practicing. And they're both good, but maybe one's a little better than the other. That's kind of the basic argument that was made in the other book. So not that, politics is inherently bad. So yeah, and often we hear something like, oh, well, just sit more, and you'll understand. So this is always lazy advice, I think. If just someone just tells you to just sit more. It's kind of too easy, I think. Or, she was told, Gross from her perspective, that awakening is the only real solution to political and social problems. And again, this sort of seems in line with what Moore was saying when I spoke the last time. But again, Moore was saying that awakening is not the sole solution, but rather, Buddhists might say it's the, preferred or better solution. So on the flip side, though, even though Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes non-duality, it still very clearly emphasizes ethics, which are dualistic in nature. And these are always kind of explained as a prerequisite for serious practice. You can't be, a liar and a thief and, kind of expect to get very far in your practice. So the dualism of ethics and the dualism of politics, require distinctions between competing alternatives. And sometimes, even absolute pronunciations of right and wrong. And this happens in Buddhism too. Some of the ethical principles are very clear. If you kill someone, you've violated the precept on not killing. There's no question there. That's an absolute. So it could be argued, that ethics are individually focused and politics is more outwardly focused. And because they require, engaging in politics requires more interpersonal struggle and, has to do with power and wealth and so forth, that makes them more inherently polarizing. But Gross argues that, politics strongly affect individual well-being, obviously. If we have good policies, we can prevent poverty, people having to go into massive debt from medical bills, you name it. Policies, can do things if we can enact them that help the individual. And she notes too that, having the time and money needed to practice Buddhism is something that a government policy could affect. Like if you have some kind of basic income, you're more likely to have the time and ability to practice a path like Buddhism. It requires a certain level of, financial comfort and so forth. Interdependence then, implies that individual and group decisions are not really separate, right? We can't really trust that line of thinking that just because ethics are individually focused and politics are group focused, that somehow they're fundamentally different because, again, we have no real separation between these things because of the way that the individual and the group are deeply interconnected. So one of the things that she notes, though, in this regard is, Buddhism very clearly supports nonviolence, ahimsa, this principle of nonviolence. But there isn't really an articulation of what we would now call structural violence. So, these are things like, racism or sexism, ageism, classism, elitism, all these kind of things are, thought of as, structural violence. But Buddhism doesn't really think about violence in that way, at least not traditionally. So this is one of the areas where, Gross says that, we can potentially make some improvements. She also notes, though, that, religions generally, Buddhism also, generally sort of took political and social systems for granted and usually didn't view them as the products of like human choices, but just they were sort of these inevitable structures. And we sort of saw that in some of the Pali texts that we looked at last time. The way that early Buddhists conceived of political systems suggested that they had been around for eons and eons unchanged, and they weren't really like, the product of people's decision making, but just things that kind of happen on their own. Okay. So another kind of argument that you might hear is that, politics is seeking to fix samsara, and what we're really after in Buddhism is escaping samsara, or that they, subvert karma, and, we have to accept karma. But, it's important to note, and I think that this is a common misconception, that Buddhism never accepts the idea of predetermination, of, some sort of absolute destiny that's already been written out. Buddhism is very clear that individual actions can change your own karma, change the karma of others. And, that, of course, applies to the group as well by extension. Excuse me. And furthermore, of course, in Mahayana traditions, samsara and nirvana are not seen as separate. They're, deeply interconnected as well, or even equated. So at any rate, the apparent difference between non-duality and apparently dualistic ethics is, bound up with this distinction between absolute and relative samsara and nirvana and their ultimate inseparability. So, we have to keep in mind these two truths, the absolute and the relative, as we look at these things. And this balance, Dogen especially, is always talking about the balance between the relative and absolute. He's always cautioning us not to think that Buddhist practice is just about the absolute. Even though in Zazen we might be kind of trying to tap into that, to the absolute while we sit, we have to still go out in the world and do stuff, which is completely relative. And for him, practice is all about the balance between these two things. So, Shobo Genzo, the true Dharma eye, that concept of the Dharma eye is literally about balancing the relative and absolute. It's being able to see both the absolute and the relative at the same time and, work together with them. So the argument that Gross is going to make is that if we engage in politics, we need to be able to do that, or at least aim to do that. If we just engage in politics as usual, we're completely stuck in the relative, and we don't have any of the absolute perspective, to make us basically function as Buddhists when we engage with politics. Likewise, if we only focus on the absolute, we'll never engage with politics at all, or anything else in the relative world for that matter. So basically, Gross says that there are two challenges for any Buddhist who wants to engage in a political cause or a social justice cause. One is maintaining equanimity and awareness while caring about a cause in the midst of conflict. And two, maintaining contentment and cheerfulness in the midst of failure and the seemingly unending obstacles to any real attainment of justice, peace, and equity. So these are the two things that she points out. So how do we maintain equanimity and kind of real awareness when we're constantly being bombarded with sort of hateful messages? And two, how do we stick with it even though nothing seems to be changing? So she kind of jokingly refers to these, being able to do these two things as siddhis. These are, kind of the supernatural powers. So in Buddhist texts, you'll hear about, doing enough meditation to be able to walk on water or swim through solid ground and stuff like that. So she equates being able to, maintain your equanimity and be patient in political struggle as sort of akin to those. That is, I guess, very hard to attain. And furthermore, that this balance again between relative and absolute is kind of one of the unique contributions that Buddhism can make to politics. Okay, so practicing while caring about a cause allows her to practice with the three poisons, she said. So she's kind of also going to make the argument that, you know, if you engage the right way, politics can actually further your practice as well, because it brings up a lot of strong emotions that we, you know, have to deal with and understand. So, you know, the three poisons, the way that she lists them is aversion, attachment, and ignoring. You know, they're translated different ways, of course, but, you know, attachment, aversion, delusion is kind of probably the translations that I'm most familiar with. I mean, you know, not familiar with, but that come up in my head. But just to sort of unpack this a little bit, just so we're kind of clear on what these things mean. So attachment is what she's translating for the second one. And the word is probably closer to sort of like desire or greed or passion or something like that. The Sanskrit word is raga, and it actually means dye, like as in a dye for clothing, and specifically like a red colored dye, so it has the sense of passion or desire. And the Chinese translation is probably a little closer to greed. It uses a character that has the radical for money in it, you know, indicating that you have this desire for more wealth. So I think, and attachment is sort of like the consequence, I think, of desire and greed. So for me, translating it as an attachment is kind of a, you know, that's like the next step. But first you have the desire and the greed, and then you have the attachment. And ignoring, I'm not sure why she says ignoring instead of ignorance or delusion, because it gives this sense that you already kind of know and you're actively ignoring it, which can happen, but you know, I think more often, you know, our brains are just not well wired to accept the Buddhist truth, and so we're not really consciously aware of it most of the time. So I think ignorance is sort of better. But at any rate, it's a little bit of an aside there. But she says, you know, even if we don't engage with politics, obviously we can't avoid the three poisons. These are deeply human things. So we're going to be dealing with them one way or another. If you engage in politics, you might be dealing with them a bit more, perhaps, but that's not to say that you can't practice with them in that context. And then sort of the basis for her argument becomes the fact that these three poisons each have sort of a flip side. And she attributes this to Vajrayana, so Tibetan Buddhist kind of understandings of things. And she calls them sort of their transmuted form. So aversion or hatred, the flip side of it is clarity. And I'll explain how this works. Greed, the flip side of that is compassion. And ignorance is what she calls spaciousness, or all-inclusive spaciousness. And this really struck me because we have the same thing in our tradition, actually. So Menzan has a text called Jijuyu Zanmai that's in this book, Heart of Zen, which is also online. So if you don't have it, you can get a PDF if you just search Heart of Zen. But he has a long kind of extended section of that work that talks about the fact that the three poisons have a flip side. And also that each one is related to one of the pure precepts. So three of the precepts that we take in our tradition are the pure precepts. So these are the, you know, the precept of avoiding evil deeds. So basically like following the precepts. The precept of doing good deeds, and the precept of benefiting living beings. So these are the three pure precepts. But what Menzan says is, you know, to really act on these, we sort of need to use the three poisons. So to avoid evil deeds, we need to have hatred, basically hatred for desire or hatred for delusion. To practice the pure precept of doing good deeds, we need to have greed, greed for wisdom, he says, you know. the virtue of illuminating reality with wisdom. We need to have sort of greed for it. And finally, to benefit all living beings, we need to have ignorance of distinction. So we can't be, treating everyone as different. We need to treat everyone as the same and sort of be ignorant of that distinction, essentially. And he has, kind of a long, extended exposition of this. But one of the kind of fun things that he says, let's see. Okay, so as bodhisattvas, we must continue the practice enlightenment of these three pure precepts until we complete ultimate awakening. And when we have attained Buddhahood, these three are called the three virtues of the Tathagata. So the three pure precepts become what he calls the three virtues of the Tathagata, not what he calls their established things. And again, those are each associated with one of the pure precepts. So he says, for example, he's talking about, again, like using these, three poisons to practice with. So for example, he says, astringent persimmons become very sweet after having been dried. If we try to squeeze out the astringency, the persimmons will never become sweet. Thus, the astringency of the three poisonous minds becomes the sweetness of the three virtues. The Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas cannot produce the sweetness of the three virtues because they try to squeeze out the astringency of the three poisonous minds. So what he's saying here is that, we're not trying to eliminate the three poisonous minds. We're, kind of practicing with them, essentially. And he says that, the, so-called Hinayana, the like bad early Buddhists, were unable to achieve this because they're constantly trying to completely eliminate the three poisons. But he likens it to drying persimmons rather than trying to squeeze them out. So, the astringency is sort of still there in some essential sense, but it's kind of overcome by sweetness. So anyways, that's how this kind of notion appears in the Soto Zen tradition. I just thought it was an interesting parallel. So let's see. Okay, so Gross does point out that, as Buddhists, we should probably try to develop a certain level of equanimity and awareness kind of prior to engaging very deeply in politics. She says that, if you don't have that, you might want to limit your involvement in causes because it may do more harm than good if you're acting completely on the basis of the three poisons. And she gives some kind of advice from her own personal experience a little later on. So for her, she says hatred is the hardest poison to deal with because first, when we engage with, the whole reason that we engage with a cause, right, is because we have an aversion to an existing social or political system. And also because we receive the hatred and aversion of those on the other side of the system being challenged. And, finally, because we often end up expressing hatred to those who refuse to accept our cause. So it's very difficult to deal with hatred on all of these levels when engaging with politics. So in her experience, she described working in academia, back in the 70s and onward. And this spurred her to become a feminist because, the field was completely male-dominated and it was just sort of accepted that that's the way it should be. And she hated this. And she felt completely justified expressing her views aggressively. She said she took delight in mentally skewering my tormentors. But after she started practicing, she said she no longer felt this kind of delight anymore. And she began to feel that expressing herself angrily was maybe not productive and possibly even counterproductive. But she said her convictions didn't change at all. She said that clarity was there beneath the anger. But once she was able to start practicing, the anger kind of dissipated and the clarity remained. So this is what she's getting at and talking about kind of transmuting the three poisons. So for her tradition, this clarity, resides beneath anger. Usually when we're angry about something, there is some maybe justifiable reason underneath it, but it gets clouded over by anger. And she also says that her tradition likens anger to water. So if water's turbulent, you can't see what's underneath of it. But once it settles down, you can see the bottom. And furthermore, it reflects the surface back to you. So if we don't get this clarity, though, all we do is feel kind of pain and grief that our cause hasn't been adopted. And expressing this sort of perceived righteous indignation at others, it sort of can cover over the pain temporarily, but it tends to return and then fuel the next bout of anger. And for those on the receiving end, what they see isn't the clarity of the cause. They just feel that they're being attacked. They just feel the anger, And I think that that's one of the reasons why expressing things angrily is not really a good way of getting your point across, and that's what she's saying here. And so in this regard, aren't we justified being angry if something's really bad? She recounts the story of one of her teachers, Khandro Rinpoche, who's a prominent Tibetan nun. So a woman asks what we should do about, things that make us angry. And she responds, anger is always a waste of time. And the student didn't like this. Said, but what about things that you should be angry about, like abuse? And the Rinpoche replied, I didn't tell you to give up your critical intelligence. I told you anger is a waste of time. So this is similar to what we talk about, I think, here at Sanshinji, the difference between, accepting and condoning. They're not the same. They're hard to separate sometimes, but we have to see that distinction. So at any rate, taming both one's anger and critical intelligence would be, of course, paramount to not caring, but that's not what the advice is. You need to keep your clarity, your critical intelligence, but let your anger dissipate. So in this story, Gross sees the student as expressing desire for what should be, but also hatred and aversion for what isn't. So the first two poisons of desire and hatred, while seemingly opposites, are actually, of course, very closely interrelated. Because we often, are expressing both of them at the same time. So like, I desire ice cream and I hate that I don't have any, So even though they seem like opposites, they're usually, going together. And as already mentioned, with causes, we desire, a system that changes and we hate the current one, so they work together in that way. So again, using this transmutation system that she's talking about, the awakened expression of what she calls attachments of desire is compassion. That is, concern for all beings without distinction between self and other. The problem is that most people involved with political and social causes, tend to only express their self-righteous and aggressive, what she calls ideological fixation, in a completely dualistic manner, without expressing sincere, all-encompassing compassion. So, usually when we desire something, it's usually related to compassion in some way. Like, often it's for ourselves, unfortunately, but we're trying to do something that we think is good, either for me or for someone else. But if all we express is the desirous portion of that, the compassion is again kind of covered over. And she says that, in the case of politics, what's really important is that we recognize the basic goodness of those on the other side. Not that they're right or that we condone their viewpoints or whatever, but just that, they're human beings with complex problems and, their own personal histories and everything. And if we don't have that compassion, we can't really engage with them in a way that's ever going to convince them. So, so again, she says, if you really care about a cause, will you not have strong and fixed opinions? Some might ask. So Gross says, cogent analysis and clarity of expression are not the same as aversion or attachment. It's possible both to care about something and be non-ideological and non-fixated in that caring. If it were not possible, the Buddhist ideal of non-dual compassion would be an illusion. So I think that this is an important point. I think sometimes we try to, juggle politics and Buddhism, and sometimes we feel so strongly attached to a political clause that we're willing to sort of throw the Buddhist one out the window. So this idea of non-dual compassion, if we're being sincere Mahayana Buddhists, I think on some level we have to accept that it's possible to do this. So we have to bring that to our political engagements, or else we're, kind of throwing out a fundamental important teaching of our, of our practice. And then she summarizes this by saying, there's a middle path between fighting with others and simply turning numb and passive, deaf and dumb, to clearly evident injustice and violence. So I think that this, finding this middle path is the fundamental point here, right? So often we think you're either engaging or you're not engaging. You're with us or against us. But there is a middle way here. You can still be a conscientious Buddhist and engage with these political processes at the same time. And further, she says that, that being correct is not enough. We often think that just, holding some ideological viewpoint is all we have to do, and then we can pat ourselves on the back for being a good person, and then we're done. So that's kind of where this section is going, but let me step back a little bit here. So she writes that one may practice not speaking out on an issue if the murky emotionalism of aversion or attachment still clouds one's mind, and such a practice is essential. And in the context of our tradition, even though we don't have kind of an analytical practice directly, in Zazen, these sort of things come up. We see the murky emotionalism of aversion when we're sitting. Of course, when we see it, we just try to let it go and come back to just sitting. But these things arise, and we need to be able to see when they arise. And that's why, she's saying that Buddhist practice can be really helpful for engaging with politics, because it allows us to see the arising of the three poisons in the way that we otherwise probably wouldn't be able to if we were just engaging as regular people. So she cautions, though, that even if you can provide clear analysis and your own clarity, it won't prevent you from being the object of other people's hatred and aversion. And here she moves on to ignorance. And the point that she makes here is that basically, if someone else is ignorant of something and you point out that what they believe is not the case, even if you're just, doing that in a very clear, gentle way, people will take the challenging of their perceived view as aggression. So in this way too, ignorance is also bound up with the other two poisons of aversion and attachment. Sorry. So yeah. So at any rate, she says, at the conclusion of this part, being correct is not enough. In fact, being correct is the easy part. So how do you express righteousness in a non-dualistic way? Buddhists who work on political and social causes come to understand why skillful means is, one of the perfections in our practice. So, there are these paramitas, the perfections that we try to practice, and skillful means is one of them. And also discriminating wisdom is the sixth. That is, prajna, so wisdom. Clarity is essentially, not of much use if you can't express it in a skillful way. So the point here is we have to, both be correct, of course. We want to have that clarity. And we have to be able to also express that correct clarity in a way that is skillful so that people can accept it without feeling threatened or attacked or whatever. And it's a very difficult thing to do, but it's something that we really need to practice with and not just ignore because it's difficult. Okay, and then her conclusion here, and I'll wrap up. So she kind of encapsulates what Buddhism can contribute to feminism or other causes. So Buddhism allows for the development of the skillful means of developing and maintaining equanimity and peacefulness in the face of opposition, oppression, and conflict. And two, it allows for long-term commitment to a cause. Through the development of this, equanimity, we can stick with something in a way that we might not be able to otherwise if we didn't have practice grounding it. And this, again, is another one of the paramitas, perfections, is patience. So the conclusion then is, though Mahayana Buddhism emphasizes non-duality and politics seems to be nothing but duality, practicing non-duality is practicing the inseparability of the absolute and the relative truths. And we shouldn't think that practice is just about the absolute and politics is just about the relative, because of course they're deeply interconnected. And so for Gross, there's much Buddhist insight to be gained from engaging with causes, but only if we do so skillfully. So that's the basic conclusion of her essay. So I think I will stop there. I've been going for about an hour. So does anyone have any questions, thoughts, or comments about anything? Yeah, Mark.
You could probably guess that I might have some comments and or questions on this. And so thank you again. This was a truly wonderful talk. I really enjoyed this one as well as the last one that you gave. And so that gives me a lot to think about. And especially, this time, I teach a class every year on deliberative democracy. It's a one-day course, and this actually happened yesterday. Where it's a one-day course where I spend a good part of a semester training students on facilitating conversations across political and cultural differences, organizing a panel discussion, organizing assignments, and then having this full day of small group discussions in which people try to be able to engage across political and cultural differences to be able to ultimately deliberate on some potential solutions to common social problems, and so, it's important that we have these practice and facilitation because inevitably there's always moments of heat that come up, right?
Yeah.
And so a big part of this is training these students on how to be able to manage like that heat and that tension when it arrives, and so as I was kind of debriefing with all the students yesterday, I was thinking back to a point of conversation that we had in our beneficial action workshop last week, and I think it relates a lot to the article that Gross's article is that, politics and political engagement and activism, these are things that, rest on conviction. I have some idea of what is wrong with the world and what needs to be done in order to be able to put it in the right direction. Buddhism oftentimes requires us to locate that humility and understanding, well, we can't always predict the causes and consequences of our actions, right? And so even if we want to be able to propose, like whether it's some law or some action, we don't necessarily know ultimately if that is going to be able to lead towards the greater good. There's always going to be this large degree of unpredictability. So one of the things that I'm trying to practice is wrestle with that that tension between doubt and conviction, right? Like that conviction that you would need as someone who's engaged, and that doubt or humility that you might want to be able to have as someone who is working with their spiritual practice. And so I think one of the things that I'm coming that I'm taking from this, and sorry if I'm talking too long, but one of the things that I'm taking from what you're saying here is that, you know, the major part of the practice is kind of, as it relates to Buddhism and engagement, is making sure that we're working with those three poisons, right? You know, and so that when we're engaging in a way, we can kind of be mindful of, is this my greed, my anger, or my ignorance that's coming on this, and making that to be a continual part, right? Like to continually engage with that sense of vow and repentance, even as we're moving toward a greater good. And that certainly has some implications for what we think of as clarity, right? You know, and I was watching these students interact with one another yesterday, they all have particular ideological convictions, and I can't, not all of them, some of them were really trying to figure it out, but it's like, you know, that having that ideology in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, because maybe things put you in a particularly ideological position, but trying to think of it, I guess, as ideologies maybe being something that's provisional, right? Like something that we have right here in this particular instance, and maybe even that provisional thing might last us our entire livelihoods, just because we're in this particular narrow place in time. But always understanding that this ideological perspective I have is something that can and should be dispensed with if necessary, like if those situations change. So I know I threw a whole bunch of different things out there at you, and so I'm being very unfair to you, but these in trying to put that out there. But as you were talking, these are some of the things that are going through my head, but particularly in wrestling with that tension between the doubt and conviction, and just kind of wondering what some of your key takeaways from all of that are.
Sure. Yeah. So the first thing that came to mind as you were talking was, you know, this idea of like unpredictability and unintended consequences. So in some of the reading that I was doing about the context of the Japanese Buddhist political engagement, was a case in the like early Heian period. So I think in like the 700s. And at that time, women could become empress. And there was a priest who tried to sort of like seduce her, I guess, in sort of like a Rasputin style way, I guess, and tried to usurp the, you know, power of the country. And, you know, I don't know, we don't know what his motivations were. I mean, you know, maybe he thought that he could, you know, use Buddhist principles to help people. I don't know. But the unintended consequence was, after that, women were never allowed to become empress again. You know, that was stripped away, and it was caused by a Buddhist. So, you know, I found that very interesting. But in terms of the main takeaways of Gross's article, yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that she's saying that we have much to gain as Buddhists from engaging with politics, because it brings these three poisons front and center, but also that as political actors, we have much to gain from Buddhism, because it allows us to be more effective as political actors. Because if we're just yelling and screaming, being pulled around by our passions, you know, people aren't that likely to listen to us. We're not that likely to be effective. And so on. So I think that she's saying that there's, you know, an interplay here that can help both sides of what we're trying to do. But the key thing is that we, you know, when we're acting politically, we don't just, you know, throw out our Buddhism and, you know, go yelling and screaming. And likewise, that, you know, when we're Buddhists, we don't, you know, forget about our political convictions, but, you know, that both are, you know, interconnected, of course. So I think that that's the kind of main takeaway as I see it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Carla.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So thank you very much for your effort. This was a really deep, wonderful talk. I appreciate your hard work. I just wanted to share something and then ask you to comment on something. So I really appreciate that you spoke about Rita Gross, and I saw her. She came to Ann Arbor and did a talk, And it was literally, I think, like 2 or 3 weeks before she died. She was obviously not well. I mean, she was walking in a cane. I mean, she did a great talk, but you know, it really was testament to her dedication that she was still traveling. You know, she was doing a really heavy traveling teaching tour, even toward the very end of her life. It was really amazing. But anyway, she did this talk, and it was, to me, very inspiring. I feel really lucky that I was able to hear her speak. She charmingly referred to Dogen as Dojin, which was really cute during the talk. But there were many kind of little snippets that I took away from it. But the interesting thing was that a few weeks after, it was then she had passed away, and then I was meeting with the teacher at the temple where she came and spoke, and we were chatting about it. And the teacher told me, she said, well, a lot of people at the talk didn't like her talk. And I remember thinking, I was like, what on earth could they not have liked about that talk? I mean, of course, my view, I'm like, wow, this is really great. But I remember her very, she didn't mince words. And she really gave a warning about feel-good Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And so you brought up a really interesting point from that essay about, toward the end when you were talking about kind of this warning. And so that sort of stuck with me, and I'm still kind of wrestling with that, like what that means, kind of the danger of that, and it's kind of like the other pit that you can fall into. And so I was just wondering if you could just comment on that a little bit, because it was just such a striking thing to me.
So just to follow up, in the which point was it specifically in my summary that resonated with that point?
You were talking about, oh gosh, it was toward the end. You mentioned that she, that we can use sort of the poisons, right, sort of productively, right, which is good. But then maybe it could fall into kind of a complacency, maybe, like, well, I have this great cause, and so I'm going to use these poisons, right? So just, you sort of danced around it actually quite a bit. And it was really good. So, but I just, again, I don't know that I really have so much of a question here. It's just, I just want to hear
no, I think that's
your talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point. That, Buddhism isn't really just about blissing out or whatever, I think that's often how it's perceived from the outside, is that we just, do this relaxing meditation and, we feel good all the time. But of course, if you've ever done any kind of serious zazen, it's quite uncomfortable and not really very peaceful most of the time. I mean, I think that is often the kind of effect that it might have when you go back out into the world, but actually engaging with the practice itself is challenging, both mentally and physically. And I think that it also is challenging to try to uphold Buddhist ethics. And I think that in Western Buddhism, sometimes the ethical aspects don't get emphasized as much as they maybe should. But it's pretty clear that, for most of Buddhism's history, that was kind of the first thing that you do before kind of engaging with meditation and stuff. And I think that, the engaged Buddhist movement, I think many of the people in it are very, clear that these ethical principles are important. But I think some other people also just want to add Buddhism to their sort of justification for why they are fighting for a certain thing, without really doing the hard work of bringing the Buddhist ethical principles to bear in their quest to do so. So I think it's really hard to have a discussion without succumbing to anger or hatred. But, our practice entails that we do that. And so, yeah, I think we can't just, fall into complacency there and say, just because I believe a thing, that gives me license to, do whatever I want to achieve it. We have to do it in a way that's skillful. And yeah, so I don't know if that helps, but But yeah, I think it's certainly important not just to do this practice because, we're trying to feel good all the time.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated how you sort of covered the whole thing. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Let's see, Hennesis and then Russ.
Hi. So at one point, you mentioned sort of how sometimes discussions on ahimsa can ignore things like structural violence. And this reminded me of an idea, and this might be kind of controversial to ask about, but I'm really curious if there's Buddhist discussions on this at all. There's an idea that's really common in postmodern thoughts that originated out of revolutionary anarchist theory in opposition to the idea of the social contract, which argues that all politics is inherently violent because it's the forcing of some sort of idea onto people through force, such as through military or tax coercion or the police, etc. And so that any meaningful engagement in politics, even something like voting or advocating an idea or pushing policy, is violent in its nature. And what is difficult for me with this, of course, is that, one, this can be used to justify a lot of things, like violence is being pushed on me so I can act back with violence. Like, think about the coup, where a lot of people felt like, violence was being used to, like, force people to, not spread the coronavirus or something like that, and various other things, mix in with conspiracy theories that led to people trying to justify, like, taking over the Capitol and stuff. But at the same time, like, even though it can be used to justify so much stuff, it's an idea that whenever I think about it, I can't really find ways that I disagree with that. And I'm curious if there have been Buddhist like writings or thoughts on specifically how to handle this dilemma that any meaningful engagement in politics is inherently violent.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. The book that I read for the last talk, Buddhism and Political Theory, sort of, in his analysis, he says that Buddhism comes fairly close to political anarchism in his view, and sort of engages with, in early Buddhism, like monarchy and stuff for pragmatic reasons, but that, Buddhists, if it were just Buddhists hanging around, they wouldn't really need a government. So, yeah, I mean, part of the problem is there hasn't been a whole lot of work on, like, academic work on Buddhism and politics. I think it's ramping up a little bit now, it seems, but I mean, the basic answer I have to give is I don't really know. There's one prominent Buddhist anarchist that I can think of, who his last name is also Uchiyama, like Kosho Uchiyama, but not related. His name is Gudo Uchiyama, so you could look that up. And he was actually executed in early pre-war Japan for supposedly being part of some plot to assassinate politicians, which turned out to be a total fabrication after the fact. But he wrote a little bit about how he thought anarchy, and I think also, like, he was sort of maybe like a, I don't know, anarcho-socialist or something, but how those kind of principles might line up with Buddhism. The book, though, is I've tried to read it myself, but it's really expensive. It's like, it wasn't published in large amounts, so to buy it's like $100, and the IU library doesn't have it right now. But at any rate, you could check that out. But yeah, I mean, I think that, Buddhism is ultimately kind of a pragmatic religion, I guess you could say. So even if it is, even if Buddhists would accept that, all politics are kind of a form of violence, they might not be willing to sort of advocate political anarchy just because, it might be too much for people to accept or something, like, or just it's not the way that things have been or whatever. So, there tends to be this kind of acceptance of the status quo to a certain extent in Buddhism. But you could check out that book and see what he says. So I'm just kind of guessing.
I have that book if you want to borrow it.
Oh, really? Wow.
This is the one you're thinking of,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I've read it.
Nice. I would like to borrow it. Russ.
Okay. Doju, I want to just thank you so much this talk. It was absolutely fascinating, and there's a lot to chew on here.
Thank you. Mostly plagiarized, but
well,
thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you. I'm going to run right out and see if I can get it on my Kindle right away. But I want to focus on the other part of that equation. I think the cogent analysis and clarity of expression, that I think that really captures a middle way here, that what we need to, where we need to go for a middle way. I want to focus on the part about critical intelligence and cogent analysis.
Mm-hmm.
How much I think we really need that when we get into what, Hennes, I was kind of focusing where Hennes was too, on the idea of Buddhism not having gone into structural violence very much, and being a new area, we really need to use our critical intelligence and cogent analysis pretty much. I look back at the 1990s. That was a talk about a period of unintended consequences. Both President Clinton and our current president, when he was a senator, both avidly supported real draconian responses to crime. The 3 strikes you're out, zero tolerance. That really led the drug war. That all really led to mass incarceration. Especially for people of color in our society, and thankfully Joe Biden has said he's sorry for that. But I think that's what happens in a time. That's why we need the critical intelligence and the cogent analysis, because we all fall into accepting whatever the underlying assumptions are that we're all bringing, the group stupidity that we're all bringing to anything. I think a current one right now is Black Lives Matter. The Trump and his allies focused on just how extremely violent they were and connected to Antifa. And most of us don't buy that. 90 analysis shows that 97% of the Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful. But I think we all sort of buy into that a little bit, that maybe we're a little reticent at times to get involved with Black Lives Matter because it has a little bit of a tinge now that maybe it's violent. And I think we have to use our critical analysis to say, is it really what should I be doing to engage or not engage in something going on in our society? That's why I recommended Patrisse Cullors' book, When They Call You a Terrorist, about her life and how that eventually led to her being part of founding Black Lives Matter. Just the understanding of what she grew up with in terms of, when she was 14, having handcuffs being put on her and thrown in the back of a police car. Anyway, I guess like Mark, I'm sorry for going on so long, but could you talk a little bit more about that idea of critical intelligence and cogent analysis and applying that?
Sure, yeah. And also just, what you were just saying reminded me of, Gross's point that if we engage in politics, we have to expect that, there's going to be a lot of hatred and ignorance coming our way. And coming up with some way to deal with that is really important. And, for Gross, of course, that's Buddhist practice. So yeah, critical intelligence and cogent analysis. So, I think that this, again, gets at this idea that, underneath our anger, we have, some clear thing there that's, being expressed through anger. But both to ourselves and to the person receiving it, it becomes, basically just anger and not the clear thing that you're trying to express. So, if you're getting yelled at, of course, the main thing that you're feeling is, wow, I'm being yelled at and it doesn't feel nice. You're not really thinking about like the words that the person is using. And likewise for the person, overcome with anger, you're also not really able to have awareness of the situation. Is the person that I'm yelling at receiving this information? Probably not. But if you were able to step back from the anger, you'd be able to see that. But being totally caught up in that emotion, you can't really do it. So I think that is what Gross is saying here, and also Khandro Rinpoche, the person that she quotes, is that we have to express that critical intelligence and not the anger. As Rinpoche said, anger is always a waste of time. It's not to say that we aren't justified being angry. That's kind of a moot point. The fact is that if we express our points through anger, if we act with anger, we're less likely to be effective in what we're doing, both to ourselves and to the other person. And Gross also says that this, leads to burnout. If you're just angry all the time, you're more likely to eventually kind of give up and give in to despair. Whereas if you have patience and, work with your anger, you can stick with it longer. So yeah, I think that to summarize, those are some of the kind of main points that she makes in that regard. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sawyer?
Yeah. Thank you, Doju, for just very, very balancing talk. And this is sort of what your whole talk was about, I guess, in a way, is how our vows interact with politics. How, particularly, like I'm interested in how our vow to free or save all beings interacts with politics. You brought up how there's a certain amount of security or something that is required in order to practice, and that political decisions have an impact on people having the security, financial or otherwise, to even sort of engage in this practice. So I wonder what you think of that as a motivation for engaging with politics.
Yeah, I think that Mark also touched on this when he was talking, this idea of vow and repentance, which I forgot to address. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really important point. And the shift, this, so Rita Gross, of course, in the Tibetan tradition, it's a Mahayana tradition. And the stuff that I was talking about last time was from the early Buddhist tradition, so non-Mahayana. So they don't have a vow to save all beings. And so that's one of the major shifts I think that we see in the engaged Buddhist movement is, they're often Mahayana traditions, trying to grapple with how to understand this vow to save all beings. So specifically to the point about kind of people being able to practice through financial security or otherwise, it'd be interesting to sort of study more about this. I mean, obviously in American Buddhism, it tends to be very white and very middle class. And it's not completely clear why, because there are other Buddhist traditions like Soka Gakkai that has been very successful, being much more diverse. And, people are still showing up and practicing and spending their time and whatever. And it's not like, if you're a low income, you can't practice a religion. There are plenty of religious practitioners who, are not middle class. So yeah, I mean, I think that there needs to be some more kind of research and discernment as to why we're kind of failing in that regard. But that being said, I think that, the more kind of financial security, housing security, whatever that you have, the easier it is to engage seriously with a practice. So, even if you might be able to go to church once a week or something, if you're, on a minimum wage income, you're not going to be able to do like a 5-day sesshin. You'd get fired if you took 5 days off of work. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's I think a serious challenge to people who say that we shouldn't engage at all politically, is because there certainly are certain policies that would like directly benefit one's ability to practice Buddhism. So there are proposals, for example, like for a basic income or whatever, like, so you can imagine through programs like that people might be able to practice more seriously. I'm not specifically advocating that, but at any rate, it seems clear that certain political policies can benefit people spiritually quite directly. So yeah, I think that we need to be realistic about that fact. So I don't know if that helps very much, but all right, I think we should probably go ahead and wrap up, huh? Unless anyone else has a final question. All right, well, thank you, everyone.